Alright, so for grass, what we're going to start with is just the simple paint effects library, which is going to be located here. And with these different options, just like we did with plants, it's a good idea to go through all of them just so that you get an idea of what's available in the library. And so just like we did before, it's just a matter of going in and just dragging these different strokes. And you'll find that there are a few different types of grass, some of which look like what you normally associate with grass, and some which might technically be considered grasses, but at the same time you may choose to incorporate in your plant library as opposed to a grass library. And so as I go through these, we'll see that there's some variety in regards to the spread of each stroke. Obviously there's variety in regards to the density and color. But as we go through these, there's just going to be some, let me actually put this guy there, a little closer. And this one was grass ornament, that one, going through. Let's get this guy in there. And what I was going to say is that as we go through it, you'll end up finding, just like with the plants, that some of them are more useful than others. And so we're almost done drawing these in. And then the big thing with plants, or with grass rather, is going to have to do with, how to cover a large area with it. Because grass is something that you think of kind of like a carpet, meaning that its coverage in your scene is rather dense and over large areas. And so going and just drawing paint effect strokes like this is maybe a little bit less, realistic. And this one you can see the default stroke is really large. So I'm going to lower the scale down on this one. Let's say to 0.5. Let's see, that's still a little big. Let's put that to 0.25. All right. So we've got all of these strokes in here, and like I was saying, that painting individual curves for grass works, but there's other ways for placement that we'll get to later, specifically using, making a small little patch of grass that you can then paint into your scene, either using like a geometry paint script or using the instancer, meaning the particle instancer. That's really a very cool way to do it. But for now, we have all of these different strokes. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to, first, let's save our scene. So let me switch my project to Kit of Parts. And let's save this out as our grass library. And let me actually switch it so we know that this is tutorial, grass library, 01. Okay, and so with our first step, with all of these converted, we'll go through and take a look. And you can see that you're going to get things like, the alien grass, which is neat looking, but at the same time for, generic landscapes, going to be a little bit less useful. Something like this AstroTurf, if we go in and take a look at it, you'll see that it's got very blunt ends to it. And then we have this cactus grass, which is actually pretty neat looking. And so something that I might use more in like a plant scenario. Just like with this cattail and corn. Field grass, which is something that I used in my gathering image. So if I go to Photoshop, we'll see that there's field grass, let's say down in this area. That's what that is. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that that's coming from the field grass preset. And back to Maya. Next one, grass bent. You can see this is something that, again, very, very blocky. Obviously, you could put a texture on that. Grass Bermuda, you'll notice has a little flower at the end. And the fact that these are tubes that are round but don't have caps, you can change the settings in the preset so it does have a cap, but for something like grass, to have each one be a tube is really not necessary. So some of these presets are just, again, a little less useful than others. But here, if we look at this one, grass carpet, this one is much more useful as generic grass, as well as grass clump that's next to it. So really, if we just look at, let's take a look at grass carpet, grass clump, grass dry blowing, grass ornament. This, in the end, for regular grass, is what you're going to be looking for, something that has this type of look as far as the geometry, where it's, basically a single strip, has a lot of segments to it, so that it can have a nice curve. And so the only thing really that we're going to want to change with these grass presets for lots of grasses that you might want to be doing is the fact that these all have a harsh cutoff. And so meaning even with the grass clump, if we zoom in, you can see that they're not going to a point. And so you can see they all kind of terminate this way. And that's an adjustment that we'll make in the stroke. This one, grass text narrow, you can see is a little odd. So if I go through and just take a look at like what do I think right off the bat I'm probably not going to use very often, and this is something that you can change on your own, making the decision what's useful and what's not. But the alien grass I wouldn't necessarily need. If I select that one, stroke slime weed, not so useful. This guy, the text narrow. So then going through and finding other ones that, this grass tube, not so useful. Grass text wide, not so much. And then if I start taking the ones that look, useful, like this tall grasses. And so this one is probably the rice one. So if we look at that and try and find rice summer, yeah, that's this one, and next to it rice autumn. So it has these sort of flowers on the end. Here we have one that's obviously a little alien looking. So that's called lichen, but I'm not really familiar with lichen that looks like that. It looks more like an underwater plant. I'm just going to get rid of it. Don't want it for my library. So based on the height of some of these things now, I'm just going to start scooting things around. And so I'm going to take this cactus grass, and let's say we choose to move that back a little bit. The cactus grass is pretty heavy, so you'll see that it's moving very slowly when I select it. And so just because the geometry for it is kind of heavy. And then let's see, I'm going to grab what's next to it, which is this one stroke astroturf. And let's move that forward a couple spaces. And so I'm just going through and sort of moving things based on height. So these two, the corn silk, I'm going to move, let's say, to there, and then the grass that I put there, the astroturf. So it's probably a little boring to watch, but I'm just doing the same thing we did before, just going through and trying to organize my library. So it's easier if you put the taller ones in the back, just to see what you're doing. So rice autumn, put back there. This guy, wind narrow, let's move that. Rice summer, I'm going to grab both of these, scoot these forward a couple spaces. Grab this one, which is taller. So that now it's just a little bit easier to judge my scene. And then some of these I'll just move to there. So just organizing my library. Okay, so now it's a little easier to see what's inside here. And if I feel like, these also, just for the sake of making my library easier, I could choose to go in and lower the scale down on that one. 0.8. 0.8. Just a little big. That one I might choose to scale down a little bit more. 0.7, 0.6. Okay. All right, so now a little easier after drawing my strokes in to evaluate. So I'm going to save my library again. And then it's the process of looking at these grasses and deciding, okay, this is a lot of stuff that's kind of similar. And so for all of these grasses, I might not necessarily want to use all of them. Some of these, if I look at this one, like that's really blowing hard to the right. That's something you can adjust with the paint effect stroke. But to be honest, with having all of these different choices in your library, you'll end up realizing that the difference between this and another one of the grasses, in the end, is really one or two sliders in the paint effects brush settings, as well as a shader. And so, since we're going to be making our own shaders, it'd be easy to take something like this one, and once it's converted to polys, make it look like this one. So that's why these start to get a little bit redundant. And then here, the ones that are tubes, like I said, I don't find that one to be very useful. So let me dump it. This one that's cut so that it's really, really fat and wide isn't really too natural looking to me for the kind of grasses I might want to put in a scene. So this is now a preference. Like, I don't really like that one. So then looking around and being like, okay, well, what else is there in here? There's this one, which if we look up close, we'll see these also are tubes. I don't think it's a great idea for your grasses to be tubes. That one's called AstroTurf. So looking through, so this one you can see also are little tubes, but this one maybe isn't, you know, something you'd use as grass. Maybe this is something you'd use as just general ground cover that maybe looks like twigs or sticks. So it's called straw. So I might use it, but use it for something that's not necessarily grass. Well, this one, if we get close, we can see, we look at it from an angle, you can see these also have some thickness to them as well. So that can be nice as far as getting a highlight along the edge for grass that's going to be really, really close up. But, you know, grass is so thin that this would be like if you're going to have grass this close to camera, which isn't too often. And that's why, in this case, I'm just going to dump it from my library. You know, I can always use this one to get a similar effect. So now I'm slowly just trying to make some decisions on how to not have so much stuff in my library that it's, you know, confusing. So the library is slowly getting smaller. Then we can go through here and take a look at some of these and decide, well, you know, that could be useful. Maybe not with such density. But obviously, if you want to adjust the density on one of these strokes, that is something that you're going to have control over. Because we can see that if I go to the sample density on the stroke, I can lower that or adjust the slider just to reduce how many of these are. And as I do that, also it makes it sort of easier to evaluate what's going on with this stroke. And you can see that this preset, you know, it's a little easier to see what they look like. So the fact that they're so incredibly straight, and obviously that's something that doesn't look super natural. So you might end up wanting to give a little bit of a curve or a bend to it by adjusting the stroke. So maybe we'll leave this in here. Same with, let's say, this stroke, just so it's not quite so dense. A little easier to see if it would be useful. This one, with all of its twists, really looks a little bizarre. So again, some of these is possible there's a plant out there that looks like it, but I see this looks to me more like a party streamer than a plant. So I'm going to get rid of that one too. And so as I go through this, we can see there's two different kinds of corn. We have corn silk green and corn silk yellow. So when I look at the two, it's kind of like, they're so similar. Is there one that I like more than the other? And so for this one, I can see there's a difference on the tips. I think the tip of this one is more to my liking than the tip of this one. So maybe I'll get rid of that. So now my library is slowly getting to be a little bit more manageable as far as just focusing in on what I might need. Okay. So now we're left with, basically 5 different types of grasses that look like kind of normal grass. So because this is maybe like bunches of twigs, while this field grass is clearly unique because we can see it has this little sort of flowering end to it. And so since I think like, okay, well these two are unique, so those I'm going to probably keep. So now let me focus in on my grasses. So what is the difference between all of these? Well, one thing you'll see that's obvious is that the difference between this and this, for example, is the width of the stroke. But be aware that if you grab one of these strokes, you can also change that as well. And so there is an offset for how it offsets from the curve, which if you go to the stroke settings and you go to brush profile, you'll see something called brush width, and that allows you to create that offset. So you can see by the default it's very, very close to the curve that's created, but if I start to increase this value or even go beyond what the slider lets me do, you can see there's a lot of control in here. So if I go in and increase the brush width, I can also go in here and increase the density, and you can see that we fill a much larger area with grass. So, but just be aware that the way that it does the width is if you're drawing curves on surface, the placement of all of these individual grass blades aren't going to all be perfectly warped to align with the surface you're drawing on. So that's where on a flat area, this can be really useful, but for things that are highly curved that you're drawing on, it could be a problem. But let's get this back to, let's say, something close to what it started at. But I just need to point out that you don't need to concern yourself with the width of these brushes too much. You're really looking at the shape of the geometry, the curve to it, and also knowing you're going to make your own shaders, so the shader is a little less relevant. So what else is there to point out as differences between these? Well, let's take a look and we'll see. This one is clumping. You can see we're getting little clumps together. This one has a little bit of that as well. This one seems to have a little bit more curvature to it. So this one, in the end, kind of similar. There's differences in color. Some of them are, longer. This one's a little bit more straight up and down. This one has curvature. So you'd want to then look at this and be like, well, do I really need 5 of these to be concerning myself with in the library, as opposed to maybe just 1 or 2 of them, and then just knowing what settings to adjust to make them do what they're doing that look like the other ones. And that, in the end, the latter is a little bit more useful. So let's take a look at a couple more of the PaintFX sliders that adjust this, so that we can reduce how many generic grass presets we're using, so that we can really identify a difference for different kinds of grass that might be necessary, as opposed to what's a little bit unnecessary in here. And so we will do that next. But before we do that, let me just save the scene, zoom out a little bit, just pause for a sec. All right, so to look at some important attributes with the PaintFX brushes that are, controlling what's making these grasses look different, and then just attributes that in general are useful to be aware of for any of the PaintFX brushes, because obviously what we're going to look at affects, all of the plant brushes and presets that we've looked at before. So clearly the idea with PaintFX is that the library that it comes with is a start point, and that you can, get comfortable with the attributes and start to make your own variations and try and create other types of plants based on reference. But critically, just since we're talking about these grasses, let's take a look at some attributes by, zooming in. And if we try and look at what the differences are between these, we'll see that they're all definitely bending quite a bit. They all look like they're being blown in the wind. And if you look at photos of grass, you'll see that, obviously if it's not a windy day, you're not going to get this much bend in your grass blades, and so that's sort of one of the primary things that you want to be able to adjust. And then beyond that, obviously there's twist, there's clumping, and so forth. And this is something that's going to be relevant to a variety of these brushes. So for example, these long grass blades that we have here, which is our stroke rice. So we have a couple of those are very, very straight. And so if you wanted to add a little bit of a bend into those, you'd want to be aware of where those attributes reside. And so we're going to select one of these presets and go to the attribute editor. And I'm going to go and select the node that has all of the attributes. And let's close it all up. And if you don't want the stroke to be highlighted, you can just select that node with all the attributes. And you'll still be adjusting it, it just won't be highlighted. So where are the controls? Well, if we look inside here, there's a lot of stuff, but primarily under tubes. Let me close everything up inside here. You'll see that you have creation and growth and behavior. Those are your third sort of main areas where you have sliders that control the look of the brushes that you're getting. So obviously if we go up to the top inside here and start looking around, there are going to be things that are relevant. So for example, the width of the brush, like we talked about earlier. But primarily just to sort of focus in on where the bend controls are, if we go in here and go to creation, a lot of this stuff is intuitive, and I highly recommend, what you're probably going to do is just go through all these attributes and play with them. Tubes per step is obviously going to control the density, and obviously width, length, and so forth. But under width scale, there's a couple things that are important. First, you'll see you have something called tube direction. So it's kind of weird that it's under the width scale, but this is initially something that has to do with the bend you're seeing in the strokes. So you'll see that the tube direction is along the normal, which means along the normal of the curve. And the curves are not visible right now, but we know we did draw curves. They're just, if we look in the outliner, we can see they're hidden. And if we go in here and we adjust the tube direction, for example, if we say along path, you'll see it's going to adjust the look we're getting a little bit, but it's not really giving us fine-tune controlled. Well, specifically, we're looking at the elevation attributes. You can see that these are non-zero. So the angle that you're getting at the origin or at the root of each grass blade, zoom in a little bit, is related to the elevation. And so you can see that that's creating inside here some of the initial bend that you're getting. And so if I raise these elevations up, you can see to 1, the grass blades are basically standing straight up. And so there is a little bit of a random pattern that we're seeing, but this is one way to adjust the bend that you're seeing. So instead of going along the curve normal, we can have them standing straight up if we want. And so if we look around, we can see that this other preset is definitely standing upright, much more so than some of these other presets. So under width scale, that's an important one. Then if we go under growth, you'll see that for grass, it's only creating branches. So you have a folder called branches. All the other folders are going to be grayed out because these are all turned off. So you can see it's all grayed out. So if we go to branches, you're going to see stuff inside here that has to do with how many branches you get, as well as splitting. And so splitting just has to do with each blade. You can see splitting into multiple blades, not what we're interested in here with grass. So none of those attributes are relevant to what we're doing right now. So that then takes us down to behavior. And behavior has a lot of attributes that are very important to controlling the bend that we see inside here. And so the first one is path follow. And you can see that's really controlling that bend. So if I go inside here and I put it to 0, you can see now we get grass that's basically standing straight up. And so I can go in here and adjust the path follow to control my bend. So if I put the path follow to 0, they're all basically standing straight up with a little bit of a bend to them. And then if I go back up here, I can still adjust an angle along the curve normal if I want. So they're all leaning to the side, but not necessarily looking like they're being blown very heavily in the wind. So if I go up here and let's say we get them to be standing straight up again. So path follow is important. The curve follow attributes are not going to be doing anything right now. We can obviously randomize the effect that we're getting a little bit. And then for the bend, also important is gravity. And so you can see the gravity is going to be pulling them down. So if I turn that off and also turn the path follow off, you can see how they're now all very, very straight. So I can add a little bit of gravity inside here to add a little bit of a bend. And as you look at this, you should start to see that, maybe this doesn't look so much like grass, but there's a lot of plants that look like this. So that's pretty much how you control bend. So there are other things that you can go in here and adjust by playing with the sliders. We do also have turbulence, which is on right now. Since turbulence is on, it means that if I still had construction history on these strokes and I hit play on the timeline, we'd see a little bit of animation. But aside from using turbulence for animation, you can still use turbulence just to adjust, if we go inside here, the look of the grass. And so I can go and increase turbulence and then adjust the frequency of that turbulence to add a little bit more randomization into how all of these strokes look. And let's just lower our turbulence down a little bit. So if we go back up here, gravity, controlling bend, path follow, also contributing to bend, and then up under our width scale, being able to control the tube direction. So for any of these strokes, those are going to be pretty important attributes as you go and design strokes if you choose to be using paint effects to create your grass. So hopefully as you look at the different grass presets you have inside here, if you ignore color, because that's going to be something we'll do later with a shader, and you just look at the shape, you can see that looking inside here, the difference between these really has to do with the attributes that we've looked at. And so, yeah, there you go. So what else might we care about with grass? So the next one is actually really important, especially if any grass is going to be close up to the camera. And it also depends on the texture that you're going to put on it. But grass is something that you can texture with something that doesn't necessarily need cutout opacity, meaning a transparency map or a cutout opacity map, which simplifies things and also increases or speeds up rendering. So things that have transparency maps or whatnot are more for it to calculate. And so ideally you can get your grass geometry to, I'm just going to go and make a couple changes. Let's say get the grass not to be bending so much and lower the gravity down a little bit. And so ideally you can just get the geometry itself to go to a point, and you'll see that, again, look at reference photos, that grass, unless it's been cut, doesn't have a hard cutoff. And all of these grass strokes you can see have blunt ends to them. So let's look at any of these strokes inside here. You'll see a blunt end, and blunt ends. So that's going to be an issue. And so the way that you control that is if we look at this stroke where we can see those blunt ends, that's also under your width scale. So if we close everything out, it's going to be under tubes. Let's close all this stuff up. And then if we look inside here and we go to the growth where we have our branches, we had a bunch of sliders inside here. Again, we have our behavior, but specifically under creation, you'll have your width scale. And very importantly is this little area. And right now you'll see that the scale is not really set. It just has a unified value from the root to the tip of each one of these leaves or each one of these blades of grass. And so this is what we want to adjust inside here, because you'll see if you go up higher, you have tube width 1 and tube width 2. And I can adjust the width of the tubes. So you can see I can go and increase the width for width 1 and mess with the width at width 2. But even if I put width 2 to 0, it still has this blunt end to it. And then I can go inside here and mess with the width at the base. So the way that you get the end to go to a fine point is to adjust in here by simply adding another little marker just by clicking on the line and just drag this down to a tip. And then I can insert another one like this if I want, so that they stay the same width and then quickly go down to a point at the end. And now you'll see all of our blades of grass look a lot more natural. So again, if I grab this stroke here, same thing, just click inside here and drag it down to a point. And then, since it's going to be fading off very quickly, you could choose to adjust how that fade is being handled. So really, for any one of these presets, doing this is a good idea. So now all of these, and then this one as well, are going to a point. And then if I look at this one and be like, man, that's bending too much, we now know that I can very easily go inside here and adjust some settings. And so I could be like, all right, well, going along the normal is not so much a big deal on this one. I just want to go to behavior and maybe reduce path follow and the gravity a little bit, so it's not being so blown in the wind. Okay, so those are some critical things to be aware of. So if we look around some of these presets that we have from grass, like another one that you might look at and think that it looks a little funny is with the corn silk that we have here. You'll see how the leaves look a little funny at the origin point. Well, that's because this one is clearly assuming that you have a cutout map or a transparency map, so that you have a leaf that then rounds out and has a little stem on it, so that you would kind of not see this harsh corner. But now you should be aware that if you did want the actual geometry to go to a point, so it's stemming off the branch, you could easily go with that brush selected and go to your width scale, and then just maybe insert a little marker here and grab the size at the origin and make it a little bit smaller. And let's actually go inside here and let's make sure we're in the right place for that. And so, okay, so for, let's go to growth. This, we can see that we're using leaves inside here. And so the leaves are going to have their own width scale, and that's what we want to adjust. And so I'm going to go and add a little marker, and then I can change the size at the origin point for that one. So you can see we can go and fade it out, have it be blunt, decide that I want the tip to go all the way to a point. I can change it from linear to smooth or to a spline. But that's the general idea inside here. So you can see now we have curved points. So this point that's selected right now is still set to linear. I can set that one to spline. Select the point at the origin and set that to spline. So now you can see we're getting smoother curving. Inside here. So that maybe looks, you know, a little bit more natural, and then potentially wouldn't need a cutout opacity map. So you could literally use the width scale to get the shape to be the exact shape of leaf that you want without worrying specifically about cutout opacity, which is pretty neat. All right. So at this point, those are some basic things to know about your brushes. One last thing to point out is that most of the grass we have in here has no thickness, but we do have this one that has some thickness to it, which we could use as straw, which is what this one's called, or just some sticks, something that would have thickness to it on the ground. But important, you know, before you would convert something like this to polys, is to zoom in and notice that these little cylinders don't have caps on the ends by default. And that's something that if they're going to be close to camera, or if you were going to smooth them, would be potentially problematic. So just be aware, easily changed. You also have controls inside here for that, which is under Mesh, End Caps. So if I turn End Caps on, they now aren't going to be open, which is going to look funny in a render if they don't have end caps. So especially if these are going to be smoothed or if they're going to have translucency, because for translucency you would, for something like this, set it to solid as opposed to thin-walled, and if it doesn't have a cap on it, you're going to get a funky look at the tip. So those are the core attributes to be aware of. So the width scale to control the shape of of each individual leaf, like we were able to see here, or with our grasses, so that they all go to a nice point, which really is going to make your grass look better. And there you go. So I think at this point we can take our grass, or some of our grass brushes that we have inside here, and maybe I'll save my library. And by saving it, you know, if I was to keep these paint effect strokes around and I've made adjustments, remember you can always select one and under paint effects get settings from selected stroke to apply to other strokes you've created in your scene. And yeah, so save our scene, and now we're going to convert this stuff to poly, look at shaders for it, specifically getting into how to make a grass shader. So this stuff, you know, we would consider to be more like plants and the stuff that we did before. So what would a shader look like for grass? Pretty much the same stuff we did before with an MIA material, but specifically just trying to fill an area with grass. So whether we're drawing it with paint effects or replicating the geometry in another way. So let's move on to actually some rendering. Save my scene, and let's do that.